Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Gettysburg College. Welcome to the 12th Blavitt Lecture. Those of you who have not been to one of these before, you're in for a real treat. Those of you who are veterans, I want to tell you, you know it's going to be a treat. And as usual, we will start with the national anthem and the great a cappella group, the Four Scores. Please stand.
Stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in
Always great. Thank you, gang. Wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do tonight is have remarks from our speaker, and then following that, a question and answer period, and then following that, a book signing in the back. And I am delighted to announce that if you are a student at Gettysburg College, you get a free book. Yes. I want to take just a moment to recognize the Blavitt family who do so much for this college. They invest themselves with a great commitment and generosity, and it is because of them that we are here tonight. Thank you all. Appreciate it. The usual introduction, I suppose, goes through a litany of biography. You have that in front of you, and it's very impressive. So I'm not going to rehearse that again with you. Instead, I'm going to make a suggestion, and that is if you are a political junkie, like I am, I think most of you in this room are, and if you're hooked on watching the hour-long shows around the dinner hour, here's my suggestion. Turn the volume down during the haranguing, the posturing, the protests, the bloviating, and so on, and just watch for the face of Howard Fineman. When that comes on the screen, turn the volume back up, and he will tell it like it is. And tonight, we will benefit from him telling us like it was, and perhaps like it's going to be in the future. Please welcome Howard Fineman.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. It just proves to me the old political adage that politics is a game of comparison. You can ask me about cable television later. First of all, I want to thank the Blavitts, because without them this lecture wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have gotten a chance to meet some wonderful kids in a class, some students in a class earlier today, and be interviewed by some very smart people for a capstone project, and gave me a chance to really learn a lot. I learned by getting outside the Beltway. Even though we're only 50 or 60 miles outside the Beltway, it's a long way from downtown DC. So I really appreciate it, and I also appreciate their purchasing on behalf of the students here copies of the paperback of my book, which for those of you who aren't students is available on Amazon.com. So I think their purchase alone is going to send me skyrocketing from roughly 105,000 on the list to up to the somewhere in the 50,000 range. If you're an author, those of you who are authors here know this, you don't really want to check Amazon every day, and I've stopped doing that. And I think when the hardback came out of my book last year in the middle of the campaign, I did get up to, I think, 25 or 30 on Amazon, and I did make the New York Times list, and I made the Post list. So I've stopped looking, but I really appreciate their giving me the boost there. I want to thank President Riggs for being a delightful host. And also my good friend Susan Eisenhower, who is where? Where's Susan? She may have gone. Oh, okay. For her friendship and for her hospitality here. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, obviously. There's so much history here, and I'm here to talk about the presidency of a man whose rise was made possible by the words spoken here and the sacrifices that were made here. There are men and I guess women lying in eternal rest in cemeteries near here who gave the last full measure of devotion to the idea not only of union, which we heard the song about, but to the idea of the equality of all men and women and humankind, and so that sacrifice is part of the reason why I'm here to talk about Barack Obama, or able to talk about Barack Obama. And I would also mention that another president and other words associated with Gettysburg, those of Dwight Eisenhower, are also very much a part of this history, because it was during the Eisenhower administration, in its last years, especially, that the Department of Justice forcefully, carefully, but with great decency, began to carry out the words written by the Supreme Court that were designed to redeem the promise made here 100 years before. Brown versus Board of Education and the cases that followed it, and the enforcement of them in the states began in the Eisenhower years. And so I would say that in codifying the ideals that Lincoln spoke, Ike is very much a part of the story of the Obama presidency as well. So those are among the reasons why I'm so delighted to be here, and to escape America's largest theme park, otherwise known as Hollywood on the Potomac. we have our red carpet moments, and I am on TV, I admit. My favorite red carpet moment, that's really like, Hollywood. We got the carpet, we got the lights and everything. My favorite one, the most memorable one, took place in 1991 when I was just starting out focusing on the White House. Then President George Herbert Walker Bush invited the then living presidents to the White House for a reunion. And believe it or not, this had never really happened before, but George H.W., being the convivial guy that he was, invited everybody in. So there on the dais that was set up in the East Room, beneath the beautiful chandeliers there, were Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and Richard Nixon. And America's leading humorist at the time, Bob Dole, came back to where we were in the back, we reporters were in the back of the auditorium at the end, and said, "Gentlemen, there they are. Hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, and evil." Bob Dole was a lot of fun to cover on the campaign trail. So I'm a kind of unindicted co-conspirator in Hollywood on the Potomac. I do a lot of TV, I do radio, in addition to writing for the magazine and writing on the web a lot. And so I've gotten to know a lot of the characters that you know and maybe love on television, like my good friend Chris Matthews, who I think was here a little more than a year ago, Keith Olbermann. I'll dutifully report the presence of applause. Don Imus, who you probably won't applaud, whose radio show I used to do, there you go, whose radio show I used to do before he had the little unpleasantness with the Rutgers women's basketball team. So these are people in show business that you see that you either love or hate. There's really no middle ground. And there's another story about Hollywood on the Potomac that involves that. Years ago, there was a reporter for ABC News that some of you may remember named Sam Donaldson. And he was a really leather-lunged, loud, obnoxious guy who asked very good questions. And he became famous back when Ronald Reagan was president. Now, Ronald Reagan, some of you may recall, was somewhat hard of hearing. Whenever Sam Donaldson came into view, Ronald Reagan became completely deaf. So that Sam Donaldson would be out on the South Lawn shouting over the whir of the helicopter blades, and Ronald Reagan would be becoming deafer by the minute, and he would wave and Sam would shout, and depending on your politics, whether you liked Reagan or not, you either loved Sam or hated him. And it didn't take long to figure it out. So one day Sam is talking to a good friend of mine, Ted Koppel, who there in the Washington Bureau of ABC News, which is right around the corner from where the Newsweek Bureau is. They're there. Sam says to Ted, "Ted, answer a question for me. Why do people take such an instant dislike to me?" To which Koppel, in that wonderful baritone of his, answered, "Why, Sam, they're just saving time." So, in the interest of time, here's what I propose to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about Barack Obama, who I first covered when he arrived in Washington as a senator. It seems like a million years ago, but it's really only 3. Remarkable. And I got to know him pretty well on the campaign trail, so I'll try to give you a sense of him as a person if I can. And then talk about how he's doing in his historic and very challenging presidency. It's almost a year since his election, and let's talk about how he's doing and how he's done. And then I'm going to come to a screeching halt and ask for questions. If you have no questions, I'm prepared, as they say on the floor of the Senate, to revise and extend my remarks, otherwise known as filibuster. But I don't think that'll be necessary. So what about Barack Obama? Well, the first thing I would say about him as a political figure is that I have never covered anybody who seemed, and who I think was, as comfortable in his own skin as Barack Obama is in his. You know, we like to joke that you have to be crazy to run for president because of the urgency and the scope of the task at hand. You have to be a little nuts to have that much desire. And you tend to find presidents as being a little needy or overbearing or not quite rounded, if you will, as people. They all have their different approaches to how to be friendly, how to interact with other people. For example, George W. Bush is what I would call aggressively friendly, maybe overbearingly friendly. George Bush was the kind of guy who liked to get inside your space because he wanted to measure you to see if you were a threat. And George Bush, of course, the key to understanding him was that he was president of his college fraternity, and he loved to give everybody a nickname. So he would give you a nickname whether you wanted one or not. So on the presidential campaign trail when he was running, I had let's see, Candy Crowley of CNN was Dolcita. That was W showing off his knowledge of Spanish. There was David Gregory, who's 6'7", who was called W called Stretch. There was a tall guy from Reuters who was called Stretch 2. And I had a nickname, and my nickname was Fine. As in, how are you doing? Fine? You doing fine? So the first thing is he'd give you a nickname whether you wanted one or not. And then the other thing is that he would grab you whether you wanted him to or not. I have many pictures of myself being administered a headlock by the future President of the United States. And I used to joke about this. I used to say that George W. would be the first president to administer noogies to foreign leaders. And guess what? He did. Do you remember when he tried to give a back rub to Angela Merkel? Okay, so, you know, George Bush is going to be your friend whether you want it or not, and it was a sort of alpha male thing where he was going to name you, put you in your place, get the sonar thing going, figure out how much of a threat you were. You know, that was W, because very insecure, really. Now, Bill Clinton was a different kind of friendly. No jokes. Okay. And, you know, Bill Clinton, when he ran for president, he would sit there in the front of the airplane, and he'd have his half glasses on, and he'd be doing the crossword puzzle. And, you know, I'd be clambering aboard with my little suitcase and laptop, and yes, there were laptops then, and they were big laptops. And he would look up above his glasses and he would say to me, "Hey, Howard, you doing okay? You doing all right?" And it was said with such unbelievable sympathy that I kind of wanted, of course I wasn't doing all right. I was on deadline and I hadn't, you know, my battery was running out and whatever. So your automatic instinct with Bill Clinton was, when he said, "You doing all right?" was to sit down and tell him the ways in which you weren't all right. And I saw this work to his advantage. That's how he survived in New Hampshire, in the midst of Jennifer Flowers and the draft and all that. He would have a speech in the cafeteria, and then, in the auditorium or in the basketball arena or whatever. And then he'd go into the cafeteria and stand in front of the, empty steam tables there, and they'd line everybody up, and everybody would come through, and one by one, people would stand in front of Bill Clinton. And for that 30 seconds in which that person was standing in front of Bill Clinton, he'd plant his feet, he's a big guy, those big gray eyes, those big hands. The people would tell him their concerns. And for that 30 seconds, it was as though there was nobody else in the world but them and no other concern in the world but theirs. And he did that person after person after person. And the news of his great tractor beam of empathy spread through New Hampshire from family to family and from spouse to spouse, etc. And that's how he became the comeback kid. But there was always with Bill Clinton a certain almost overbearing quality to this. You couldn't quite believe, if you stood back for a second, you couldn't quite believe that he actually did have that level of concern for you. How could he? No human being is capable of that much concern. And of course we know the other side of that story. So that's Bush and Clinton. Obama, it's totally absent with him. He seems to be an unbelievably regular guy who is ambitious but is not needy, who is proud of who he is and doesn't really need, on a personal level, to be president to tell him who he is. He doesn't need the whole country telling him who he is. And I think that's because of the circumstances of his upbringing. That could have gone one of two ways. Either he would have become a loner and, an observer and kind of a reclusive guy because he was moved around from place to place, from Hawaii to Jakarta, back to Hawaii, to Los Angeles, to New York, to Cambridge, to Chicago. And yet everywhere he went, rather than draw back, he accommodated himself easily with a great gift to his surroundings. And, that's a great gift of his. So that when you interview him, and I used to interview him a fair amount in his Senate office, he would never sit behind the table, behind his desk. He would get out from behind his desk, and he would take you over to another place where there was a couch and a coffee table and a couple chairs, and he'd have his tie would be loosened and jacket probably off, and he'd put his feet up on the coffee table, and I would try to decide whether I should put my feet up on the coffee table. Some of you heard that story already. And you just talk. And, the relationship between reporters and politicians is a ongoing act of mutual seduction and betrayal. And you don't know which is happening at which moment and who's betraying or seducing whom. And I've been on a lot of these transactions that somehow feel unclean. But Obama has a great gift to make you feel as though you're just having a conversation about something, just the two of you, and it's real, and nobody's needy, and nobody's getting screwed, and it's remarkable. It really is remarkable. And I would say that he hasn't done that enough as president, but that's a whole other story. And he assumes a level of familiarity and friendship with you, but not in an overbearing way. A little needle here, a little needle there, a little bit of barbershop, but it's very skillfully and unobtrusively done. For example, out in Ankeny, Iowa, the big Harkin steak fry, summer of 2007. All the candidates are there. Everybody's piling their plate full of fried foods at the Harkin steak fry, where they fry everything that moves in Iowa. And you go through the tent. I'm feeling guilty that I haven't put any salad or green vegetables on my plate. And, of course, Obama, who's very careful about his waistline and his health, had taken the right kinds of foods, And I'm walking around the picnic area, and I bump into Obama and his guy, and Obama, who I already know, but not that intimately, says hello, and we chat, and then he looks down at my plate, and he says, "Howard, there's nothing green on that plate." And again, seduction and betrayal, but very, very skillfully done. Now, this is a guy who doesn't like to be surprised, and who doesn't, even more, like to be seen as being surprised. Because he's Columbia, president of Harvard Law Review. He's, now to switch modes here, he's Barack Obama, and he is the smartest guy in the room, even if he doesn't act like it. And so, if he encounters a situation where he's made to look foolish, he hates that. He hates it, because it doesn't comport with how he likes to think of himself. For example, in late May, I was invited to a background briefing at the White House. I was there and 6 or 7 other journalists. We're sitting out in the patio with Rahm Emanuel, who is spinning us furiously about the great early successes of the administration. And who should wander by prearrangement but President Obama? Coat off, tie undone, the whole thing. And we're chatting. Now, the day before that, the Senate, in a surprising vote, had sort of risen up from its slumber and voted to deny, like 92-0, a defense appropriations bill because it didn't spell out exactly what would happen to the prisoners in Guantanamo. And there was talk about how they would all go to American prisons. And this caused a huge sort of early summer storm of protest that was pretty unexpected, which is probably one of the reasons why we were invited in to be spun the next day by Rahm about how much in control they were of everything. So there has to be a skunk at every garden party, and I'm it. So as we're chatting, I piped up and I said, "Mr. President, were you surprised by that vote in the Senate?" And it was an obnoxious question. And he gave me a look like, "How dare you? Me? Surprised?" And he said, "No, I wasn't surprised. Were you?" And there was a slight edge of disdain and menace in it that I'd never seen before. And it wasn't personal. It was, I do not get surprised. And I think that's interesting. He loves complexity, unlike the previous occupant of the job. Now, it was a fault in the previous guy, not to be afraid of complexity. Again, I'll get to this in a minute. Obama's got to beware not to glory in complexity. Again, not just because you're the smartest guy in the room doesn't mean that you have to understand every little detail. You got to keep your eye on the ball. He's been lucky, and I think he understands his luck. When he ran for the Senate in 2004, the way was cleared not by one sex scandal, which knocked out the guy in the primary, but by 2 sex scandals, which the other one having knocked out the Republican in the general. So he was left to run for the Senate against a guy named Alan Keyes, and if you're political junkies, you know what a joke that was. But I think Obama understands that. I think he understands it. And most important, I think he wants to make history. He's already made history, and he knows that. He's a student of history, including Lincoln, and he knows that. I think he understands the import of the Gettysburg Address and didn't just memorize it. He probably didn't read Edward Everett's 2-hour speech, but he understands why Lincoln's was better. And he wants to make history. And I think that's what drives him. I think that's what drives him. And I think overall that is a very good thing, because I think he wants to make history for the right reasons. He wants to continue the work that the founders set us to doing, of making a more perfect union, which when you think about it is a complete oxymoron. More perfect. Well, that was the bargain that they struck in Philadelphia, to declare it both perfect and imperfect at the same time. And we've been trying to reach the point in the sidewalk ever since. And I think Obama's trying to head us in that direction. So briefly, let me talk about how he's doing. Let's do a little scorecard here. You may recall when he was elected and when he was inaugurated that fear gripped the world. Now, Barack Obama is not single-handedly, by any means, responsible for dispelling that grip of fear. Nor has that fear, the underlying fear, been ameliorated. It's still there. But I think you'd have to be churlish and stupid not to give him and his administration some credit, some real credit for having brought us back from the brink psychologically. Because those of you who study economic history know that psychology has a lot to do with economics, and that fear has a lot to do with prosperity or the lack thereof. And the fact that this new president, at a relatively young age, I think the third, if I'm not mistaken, the third youngest president ever sworn in, who had very little experience in government, really. I mean, what he did in Springfield doesn't amount to a hill of beans. The moment he got to the Senate, he began running for president. I mean, he didn't have that much experience. This was basically an untested guy who won in part because John McCain, who's a wonderful man in many ways, gave testedness a bad name. And Dick Cheney did likewise. And Donald Rumsfeld did likewise. So people were saying, you know, enough of the tested people. Let's get an untested person. Well, that sounded good until the whole world threatened to fall apart. And then Obama had to step in there. And he had to pick the right people, and he had to make the right decisions. And whatever else you want to say, and there's a lot plus and minus that you can say, they have to be given credit. President Obama and Larry Summers and Tim Geithner and the whole, and Bernanke and all those people, and have to be given some credit for changing the psychology. I think that was important. I think the stress test was brilliant. You know, the bank stress test, that was a brilliant maneuver. Everybody knew in advance what was going to happen, which is they're going to find most of the banks passed the stress test, but still it was the stress test. I think that was smart. The stimulus package was messy, not well targeted, passed with a minimum support, almost no support from Republicans, but it was following the old Navy adage, don't just stand there, do something. And as inexact as it was, and as wasteful to some extent as it may turn out to be, I think it was a good thing overall. The Fed intervention in the banks was good. The changing the TARP around to directly bail out the banks was good. All that, at least initially, brought us back from the brink. I think he hired smart people overall. I think the quality of the people in the cabinet and all those many czars, you know, they have so many czars they're going to need a czar. Maybe that's what Obama's supposed to be. But those are smart people, by and large. Carol Browner, Larry Summers, you know, these are smart people. Obama cares about credentials, maybe a little too much Ivy orientation. Don't forget The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam. But smart people. And I think Sonia Sotomayor went through relatively unscathed. They researched her pretty carefully. That was his pick. I watched her in her first argument. I went to the Supreme Court for her first argument the other week, and she's full of spit and vinegar. And I'm going to want to pay to see the wrestling matches between her and Antonin Scalia. They're going to be great. So that was good. The fact that he has an ambitious agenda is good. There's nothing wrong with an ambitious agenda. I think it's good to have big dreams and hopes and to want to try to make that more perfect union in terms of health care, environment, financial regulation, reform, and so forth. The Nobel Prize. A lot of nasty comment about that. I kind of jumped on board a little bit in Newsweek. But let's step back from that for a minute. What's wrong with a president being admired in the world? What is wrong with that? You have to be a little churlish to say that that's not a good thing. His approval rating is decent, 56% right now. He actually went up a couple points after the Nobel Award announcement, so despite the commentary out in Washington. And as I said, I think he wants to make history. He already has. And I'll say it again, it's a direct line, but a jagged line, from Lincoln's words here to Barack Obama's inauguration, which I must say, I was sitting like from here up to there to Obama beneath the podium, and the most amazing sight was not Obama, but if you turned around and looked at that mall with 1.5 million people in a moment of great peace and contentment and pride, that is something that every American, whatever his or her politics, should cherish. And Obama made that happen. You can say that it was the campaign handlers, or it was the Times, or it was George Bush's failures, or McCain's picking Sarah Palin. I mean, say whatever you want. Obama is the one who made it happen. He deserves great credit for that. So all that's on the plus side, but one thing I learned in covering politics for a long, long time and listening to thousands of speeches, the most important word in any speech is the word but. But there's another side. Unemployment is a mess and going to get worse. And the positive side of the stimulus in terms of psychology has a downside, which is that it's like spraying water in the desert. It's not that focused, and therefore wasteful. The disparity between the richest and the poorest is not being ameliorated yet. And every time they give another bonus to AIG, it gets wider. This is a big problem that Barack Obama, who likes to work through the inside, not the outside. It's paradoxical. He got elected as an outsider, but he's by nature an insider. Don't forget, he's a credentialed guy. He likes the inside game. That's how he became president of the Harvard Law Review. He's not a rabble-rouser by nature. I'm not even sure he's a populist by nature. Really. But he ran that way. He stirred up 13 million people on the internet, and they want the guys at AIG strung up by the nearest lamppost. He's got to deal with that. He's got to deal with the disparities of income. He's got to rejigger the stimulus package. Also, we've borrowed so much money, and we're about to borrow a lot more. Now, you can say that there are advantages in a weak dollar that'll make exports more attractive. And that's true up to a point. But not when you're talking about $10 trillion. Not when we're talking about mortgaging the lives and the livelihoods of our children and grandchildren and their children to try to support the credibility of a dollar that we have been lucky enough to have be the reserve currency for the last half century. I would remind you, if we are no longer the reserve currency, we don't get to set the interest rates anymore. Other people do. And we will surrender the very freedom that Lincoln was talking about here, and that in a way we fought the Civil War to preserve. There are all kinds of freedom in slavery, and too much debt is one of them. And that's something that he has to be serious about. Now, I'm familiar with what happened in the Depression, and I know that Andrew Mellon and all the people who were idiots were saying, oh, we got to cut spending, and, we get the pre-Keynesian thing. Yeah, I know all that. And I buy all that. And we need stimulus, and we need fiscal stimulus, and all that stuff. But I do think we need to be careful, and I'm not sure that the president has really stared that in the face, which he needs to do. Now, people love him in the world, but will people listen to him in the world? I'm not sure how great a negotiator he is. Not sure. He was never a courtroom lawyer, or rarely a courtroom lawyer. He was a constitutional law professor. He likes to bring everybody together. I think he has a more judicial temperament, judicious and judicial temperament, than a prosecutorial temperament, than a criminal lawyer temperament. And sometimes when you're president, you have to go out and prosecute the case. And sometimes when you're commander-in-chief, you have to go prosecute the case as well. You got to be a good negotiator. So we take the missiles out of Eastern Europe. The Russians are happy. We're worried about Iran. We declare victory when Medvedev says that he is concerned about Iran and nukes. Then a week later, Putin, who runs the show, says we're not that concerned about it. So, you know, you don't want to just be liked in the world. You have to be respected or even feared in the world. And he's got challenges there, and in Afghanistan, and in Iraq, and in the Middle East, in Israel and Palestine, and in Latin America, and all over the world. And if you're still going to be the leader of the free world, you have to be a tough customer. And we have yet to see how tough he's willing to be. You have to be thoughtful. And I think it's good that he is carefully considering what to do in Afghanistan. People who are saying, you know, time's a wasting, you know, you need to decide right now. Well, first of all, we've been there for 8 years. I think it's the longest war in American history, except for arguably the Revolutionary War. I think we have another couple of weeks. So I think it's good that he's thinking, but the challenges lie ahead. And I think that's where I'm going to stop. We have time for questions. I'm willing to stay here as long as you want for me to answer questions if you have them. Then I think I'm going to sign books for the kids in the back. And so please, ask a question. Ask about anything. Ask about, you know, what is Chris Matthews really like? Ask about how my hair went from that color to this color. It has to do with show business. Ask anything. Ask anything, really. Anybody have a question? Don't be bashful. Yes, ma'am. What is Chris Matthews really like? Well, first of all, he's one of my best friends. So keep that in mind. Secondly, when my mom, who's 86, was ill a few months ago, she's recovered now, thank God. Chris took me aside after the show and said, one day, I know your mom is sick. He said, you get up there. You spend as much, Pittsburgh's my hometown. He said, you spend as much time up there as you can. You don't know how valuable it is. Go there, go there, go there. So he's got a big heart. He's the middle of 5 brothers in a Philadelphia family where the father was a court reporter who I think barely graduated from high school, but yet could take dictation at 150 words a minute and type 150 words a minute. And the father was an incredibly hardworking guy who was, I think, from an English background. Chris is half Irish. He's not all Irish, which is in key to him. If he seems a little confused sometimes, that's why. And the father, of course, ended up knowing much more about the law than any of the fancy pants lawyers that he was dealing with. And the dad would come home at night and sit there in the kitchen table or the dining room table typing his notes from the court at 150 words a minute. And Chris is the middle brother, so if he's talking all the time, it's because if he wasn't obnoxious, he'd never get any food when he was a kid. And the great thing about Chris, in addition to his electrifying mind, I'm telling you, the guy's brilliant. Now, not every dot he connects should be connected to every other dot. Sometimes the wiring gets confused. But he has the gut of the average guy in Philly on a street corner who has both the hopes and the resentments that I think of as middle America. And that's his great gift. So I love to listen to him react to things. People cringe. Don't cringe. Listen to what he's saying. Listen to what he's saying. You don't have to agree with him. He speaks for a lot of people in the country. Not the same people, by the way, that O'Reilly and Beck speak for. Because Chris's people aren't haters. Chris's people are dreamers. So that's Chris. Yes, sir. Just ask a question. Do me a favor. Just ask a question really quickly because there are other people who want to ask questions. Okay. The question was, is Obama about to enter the war trap? Because he's used the phrase war of necessity. He said the war in Iraq was not a war of necessity, but the war in Afghanistan is a war of necessity. That's what he said in March. Now they're redefining what necessity is. He's talked about nation building, but then drawn back to some extent from it. I think he's reconsidering all that right now. And I think while he might not use the phrase war trap, he's perfectly aware of what you're talking about. Barack Obama, in part, is trapped by his own rhetoric from the campaign. In order to outmaneuver Hillary Clinton and John McCain, he said, no, not Iraq, but yes, Afghanistan. That's because he wanted to show the American people that he wasn't afraid to use force, but we were using it stupidly. That what we needed was smart force, and his demonstration of how he would be a smart commander-in-chief was that he would focus on Afghanistan. And then he doubled down on that in March when they put more troops in Afghanistan, when he backed that up and said the reason is this is a war of necessity, not a war of choice. Using the formulation, the familiar formulation turned into a book recently by Richard Hawes, the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Well, now, is it really a war of necessity or not? Now we've said, no, we're not going to do nation building in Afghanistan. We're moving in the direction of saying we're not going to do nation building in Afghanistan. We might even allow the Taliban back in Afghanistan as long as they make a deal with us to rid Afghanistan of al-Qaeda. That's where we're headed. I think in the meantime, he will probably agree to put some more troops in. Now, we've already gotten up to, I think it's going to be 68,000. The Post had a story the other day about support troops, pay another 8,000. I think he'll probably, if McChrystal asks for up to 40,000, Obama will probably agree to another 10 or 15 maximum in an effort to show that he hears what you're saying but has not given up on the project yet. I'd be really surprised if he does a 180 on Afghanistan. I'd be really surprised. He's not a 180 kind of guy. He tends to move cautiously and carefully. It's so paradoxical because, well, not really. His campaign was, I'm from the grassroots, I'm from the outside, I'm an outsider. But again, he's not a radical person by mentality. And he's not a person of quick leaps. He's not a person of sudden change. Personally, he's very conservative. I'm talking about personally. He's quite conservative and cautious and judicial. And not for him to pound the table. That's not the way he is. So that's my prediction, 10 to 15,000. Yes, ma'am. Who is that? Oh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, the question is, why will Obama not go on Fox? I think he's making a mistake. I think he should go on Fox. But I could see why they think that way. Because even though I think Fox has some good straight news reporters in the White, for example, I think Major Garrett's a pretty straightforward reporter. I thought Carl Cameron is a pretty good political correspondent who had a whole life before he ever joined Fox. So did Major Garrett, working for U.S. News and other publications. Their argument is, the White House's argument is, yeah, they have some straight reporters during the day, but as soon as the sun goes down, they go crazy. And they're talking all the time about birthers and, they're just stirring up this sort of paranoia and fear of the other or something, of government, and why lend any credibility to them? I guess I understand that. But my first instinct is then reward the daytime guy. In other words, what I think he should do is give an interview to Major Garrett and run that during the day, because that way at least you'll get to some of the Fox audience. You don't want to write off the whole audience. And that way you can send a message to Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly, screw you, I'm not going on your show, but we'll give the straight reporters a shot. And I think that's what David Axelrod was trying to work out with Roger Ailes. I don't think it did work out. As to the question of Obama's visibility, I have nothing against his visibility. I think, he's a pleasant guy. You want to see him, you want to think about him because he's a good guy. But when he gets out there, he's got to have something sharp and specific to say. This lack of prosecutorial thing. It's just my opinion. I think that he needs to, rather than in the case of health care, which we haven't discussed, rather than let the Congress do the whole thing the way he has and try to come in at the end as a closer, I think he would have been better served, and he will be better served at some point. Now maybe he's going to pick the exact right moment when all the pieces are there on the table and it's right there in the conference committee, and they got to make the final deal, and Obama's going to come in and bang, 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 and then we're going to have it. He's going to get it. Maybe that'll happen. If he pulls it off, it's going to be pretty remarkable. But my other problem with it is the economy is the main thing everybody's worried about. Yes, people are concerned about health care, and it's an important, worthy project. But most people want to see him talking about the economy all the time, it seems to me. And the other thing is that the bill that the Senate Finance Committee passed, to me, is not really thoroughgoing reform. What it is going to do is it's going to shovel a lot of premium money and tax money to cover a lot of other people, which is good, at the existing structure. We're going to be shoveling money into the same industry that we're saying at the same time is so cruel and wasteful. The doctors, the hospitals, the pharmaceutical manufacturers, the so-called stakeholders, the medical equipment people, the health insurance companies, they're all maneuvering for advantage to see who's going to make how much money out of this thing. Why do you think everybody except the health insurance people are still at the table? What's happening now is that the drug manufacturers who made a separate peace with Obama for $80 billion are saying, okay, we're supporting this bill. The doctors are saying, and nurses are saying, we're supporting the bill. The hospitals are saying, we're supporting the bill. The medical equipment people will probably support the bill. What they're trying to do now is isolate the health insurance companies and make them take the big hit. And that could lead to an open war among the various constituencies, which I'm not sure in the end is going to help Obama. Anyway, I wanted to mention health care. Any other questions? Yes, sir, you in the back.
Picking up on the comparison that you were doing
don't know. We don't know the answer to that yet. In other words, is he so pragmatic and so playing the inside thing and making deals with all the industries and, you know, splitting the baby on Afghanistan that he, even though he has big ambitions and big dreams, that he's going to get lost sort of in the weeds. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, he may be playing a deeper game than we quite realize here. Remember how he got to be president of the Harvard Law Review. Okay, there was a radical leftist candidate, white guy, and Obama offered himself as to head the Harvard Law Review, and there's an election for that among the board, by, I think it's time to quit, by promising to, you have the other light switch? Anyway, by promising to publish the articles of the conservatives on the board. So he cut an inside deal and made progress that way, and he published the articles and made the Harvard Law Review more interesting to read and more broad-based, which was good. So I'm not sure that he's totally given up on the public option yet. He had to downplay it to get the stuff through the Senate. Now they're going to reinflate it to get it through the House. They're playing a very, very complicated game here. There's so many moving parts. It's 1/6 of the economy. So I'm not willing to say that it's over yet. And I'll say this, whatever they do pass, and I think they will pass something, they will declare to be historic. Okay. Whether it really is not or not is another question. I think given the light situation, we have time for like one or two more questions. Yes, sir. Okay, the question is, why not more about tort reform if there's problems in health care? I think if you talk to any doctor, they will tell you that the fact that they're afraid of being sued all the time makes them prescribe things they shouldn't prescribe and seek tests that they shouldn't need, and that it is a factor in spiraling health costs. I don't think there's anybody who really doubts that. There's a lot of argument about how much of a factor it really is, but it is a factor. The reason you don't hear more about it is quite simple. The trial lawyers are one of the most important constituencies of the Democratic Party. And they would tell you that it's very much in sync with the populist nature of the Democratic Party. That those trial lawyers need to be free for the good of America to create class action lawsuits to deal with problems that the legislatures of the country and the Congress won't deal with. They've come to think of themselves as another legislature. At least that's what they tell themselves. And that's a powerful argument. And it's one that most Democratic politicians, especially after they've received major campaign contributions from them, tend to agree with. So that's the answer to your question. Okay, students. Yes, sir. Okay, if I think I understand your question, George W. Bush was able to sell the war in Iraq without convincing evidence to do it, right? But here we have a situation where everybody can see that health care is a problem. There's a lot of convincing evidence it's a problem, and yet this president, we haven't sold it. It hasn't been sold yet. Is that what you're saying? The Congress isn't supporting it. Well, the reason is, well, first of all, just a brief bit of history. People were afraid when before we went into Afghanistan, those of you who are old enough, think back to 2001. The United States had been the United States had been attacked. United States had been attacked. We realized it was Al-Qaeda. We realized that the Taliban was harboring Al-Qaeda. We wanted to strike somewhere. The logical place to strike was Afghanistan. And yet, before we went in, there were all kinds of dire predictions by the military experts that we couldn't defeat the Taliban, that it would be a disaster for the United States. Go back and look at what was said at the time. And George Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and the others said, no, we can kick butt in Afghanistan. And we went in there, and sure enough, we did. So after that, not to excuse the media for its failures, but after that, at least for a couple years after that, everybody was saying, hey, you might not like Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld and these guys, but they sure know how to fight a war. You don't remember this, you're too young, but that's what was being said. And so when it came time to sell the war in Iraq, especially when Colin Powell went before the United Nations, having famously thrown out some evidence, sort of like the bank stress tests, if Colin Powell said, no, you can't say this, we can't say this, we can't say this, but I, Colin Powell, am willing to say that convinced a lot of people. And I think it's something that Powell has come to deeply regret, but that's another story. So in the Congress, especially after the administration's early success in Afghanistan, as it was perceived, despite the growing anti-war movement, despite Barack Obama's speech in 2002, casting doubt on the whole theory of going to war in Iraq, we went, and most members of Congress went with George W. Bush. And you can call it an excess of misplaced patriotism. You can also say that the media, and I think there's justification here, was not as skeptical as it should have been, for sure. And there we were. And most members of Congress were not going to get in the way of that. They were not going to get in the way of that for a whole host of reasons I think are probably pretty obvious to most of us. In the case of reforming or changing the healthcare system, again, a sixth of the economy. We're talking about $2.5 to $3 trillion a year. We're talking about millions of people being employed and getting benefits from. We're talking about major lobbies. We're talking about a bigger sector by far than the defense industry or the auto industry or virtually any other industry. I mean, the biggest growth industry in America now is healthcare. And if you're going to get in there and monkey with it, let alone try to change it radically, you're going to run into a huge number of vested interests, and they're going to try to buy and neutralize and guide every member of Congress that they can. And so all the members are hearing, on the one hand, from people who don't have health care, but they're also hearing from their local hospital and their local doctors and their local medical equipment manufacturers, and in the case of, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, from every pharmaceutical manufacturer. These are huge interests. You don't just get in there and rewire 1/6 of the American economy without there being a huge fight. And that's what's going on right now. And however it turns out, I'm delighted because it gives me something to talk about on cable television. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Folks, two things. Number one, a reminder that for all the students, free books, but for the rest of us, for a ridiculously low price, we can have the same book right in the back of the room. All right? Thank you for coming out, and thank you, Howard, for your candor, for your insights, and for your humor.